On October 5, 1997, a hotel maid in Bloomington, Minnesota, walked into a room and found a professional wrestler lying still on his bed. He was only 35, and just hours later, thousands of fans were waiting to see him perform live. His name was Brian Pillman. His death was not shocking because it came out of nowhere, but because people around him had been watching it unfold for weeks. This is the story of his final 48 hours, but to really understand those last moments, you have to look at the months before, when his body was already breaking down and those closest to him could do nothing but watch it happen. Brian William Pillman was born on May 22, 1962, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His father died of a heart attack when Brian was just 3 months old. That detail matters. Remember it. Because it is the thread that connects the beginning of this story to the end in the cruelest possible way. As a child, Pillman developed throat polyps that required somewhere between 31 and 40 surgical operations. His vocal cords were scraped so many times that his voice was permanently damaged, leaving him with the distinctive raspy tone that would later become one of his greatest assets as a professional wrestler. But as a kid, it made him a target. Other children mocked him relentlessly for it. He spent large portions of his childhood in hospitals, only going home for Christmas. But Brian Pillman was not the kind of person who let adversity define him. He was the kind of person who used adversity as fuel. He played football. He was good at it. Good enough to play for the Cincinnati Bengals in the NFL. Good enough to play in the Canadian Football League for the Calgary Stampeders. And when a football injury ended that career, he pivoted to professional wrestling, training under the legendary Stu Hart in Calgary. From the very beginning, Pillman was special. He had a combination of athletic ability, charisma, and creative intelligence that set him apart from virtually everyone else in the business. This was a man who had been told his entire life that he was too small, too damaged, too fragile to compete at the highest level. And every single time someone told him that, he proved them wrong. His entire existence was built on defying expectations, on being underestimated and then making the people who underestimated him look foolish. In WCW, as Flying Brian, he was doing things off the top rope that American audiences had never seen before. He could work with heavyweights and cruiserweights alike. He could match Jushin Thunder Liger move for move in a technical classic and then turn around and have a believable brawl with a heavyweight twice his size. He could be a babyface or a heel. He could wrestle. He could talk. He could think. Jim Ross always put him over on commentary for his heart and courage, drawing parallels to his football career and his refusal to accept limitations. And those were not empty words. That was the genuine character of the man being channeled through a headset. He held the WCW Light Heavyweight Championship. He held the United States Tag Team Championship with Tom Zenk. He had classic matches that people still talk about 30 years later. But perhaps more importantly, he had the mind of a booker trapped inside the body of a wrestler. He saw angles and possibilities that nobody else could see. He understood the psychology of the audience on a level that most performers never reach. And then he teamed with a young Steve Austin to form the Hollywood Blondes. Austin himself would later admit that Pillman came up with virtually everything the team was remembered for. The name, the camera gesture they made on the way to the ring, the attitude, the swagger. They won the NWA and WCW World Tag Team Championships in March of 1993 and held them for 6 months. It was a partnership that both men would look back on with deep fondness for the rest of their lives. Two future legends who did not yet know they were legends, figuring it out together on the road. And then he joined the Four Horsemen with Ric Flair and Arn Anderson and Chris Benoit. Even Ric Flair, the man who defined what it meant to be a main event star, wanted to work with Pillman. That tells you something about how special he was. When Ric Flair says, "You have something, you have something." And then Pillman created the loose cannon. And that is where the story starts to turn. The loose cannon was Brian Pillman's masterpiece and his curse. The genesis of it was actually a business strategy hatched with Eric Bischoff. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Pillman would act so erratic, so unpredictable, so genuinely unhinged that the WWE would come calling with a big contract offer. Then Bischoff could counter with an even bigger deal. It was a negotiating tactic disguised as a character. The problem was that Pillman executed it so perfectly that nobody could tell what was real anymore. Not Bischoff, not the other wrestlers, not the fans. Maybe not even Brian himself. It was a character built on blurring the line between what was real and what was performance. A worked shoot taken to its absolute extreme. Pillman would do things on camera that left everyone, including the other wrestlers, genuinely unsure whether he had lost his mind or was playing the greatest chess game in wrestling history. He outed Kevin Sullivan as a backstage booker on live television during a strap match at Super Brawl in 1996, looking directly into the camera and saying the words that shattered kayfabe for anyone paying attention. He grabbed Bobby Heenan by the collar on live television so aggressively that Heenan blurted out an expletive on the air, genuinely startled by the intensity. He convinced Bischoff to legitimately fire him, taking a real letter of termination and using it as his ticket to the WWE. Bischoff thought he was still in control of the situation. He was not. Nobody was in control of the loose cannon. That was the entire point. He showed up in ECW and took the character to places that even Paul Heyman found uncomfortable. The lack of limits in wrestling's most extreme promotion allowed him to push the loose cannon persona into territory that would have been impossible anywhere else, and then he leveraged all of it into a contract with the World Wrestling Federation. It was brilliant. It was ahead of its time by years. The entire concept of blurring the lines between reality and fiction, of making the audience question what was scripted and what was genuine, would become the central ethos of the Attitude Era. Brian Pillman did it first, and he did it better than anyone who came after him. And it was also the moment when the character began eating the man alive. On April 15, 1996, everything changed. Pillman was driving his Humvee when he was involved in a catastrophic accident. The injuries were devastating. His face was so badly damaged that it took 6 doctors to reconstruct it. They had to peel his face back and cut into his scalp just to perform the surgery. His ankle was shattered so severely that doctors had to fuse it into a fixed position. He would never move the same way again. The aerial wrestler who had dazzled audiences with his acrobatic style was gone forever. And that is when the painkillers truly took hold. Pillman had struggled with substances before. He had been arrested in 1993 for drunk driving and illegal possession of prescription drugs. But the Humvee accident created a dependency that would consume the final year and a half of his life. The fused ankle meant constant pain. The constant pain meant constant medication. And the medication opened a door that Brian Pillman could never close. When he finally arrived in the WWE in late 1996, he could not wrestle. His ankle was fused. His mobility was destroyed. The high-flying style that had made him famous was physically impossible now. He had to get himself over purely on personality. And here's the thing about Brian Pillman. Most wrestlers in that situation would have been finished. If you cannot work, you cannot draw. That is the fundamental equation of the business. But Pillman was not most wrestlers. His mind was his greatest weapon, and his mind was still intact. If anything, the desperation of his physical limitations made his creative instincts sharper. The Pillman's Got a Gun angle with Steve Austin in November of that year was designed to showcase what he could do without his body. The concept was revolutionary for its time. A live home invasion angle. Austin breaking into Pillman's actual house while a camera crew filmed. Pillman's wife and children visible in the background. Pillman's friends surrounding the property like some kind of suburban militia. And when Austin finally broke through, Pillman pulled a 9mm Glock handgun on live television, pointed it directly at his former tag team partner. Melanie screamed. Kevin Kelly screamed. The feed cut out. The USA Network lost its mind. Vince McMahon had to apologize on air the following week. The line between entertainment and reality had been obliterated. Pillman and Austin had been like kids waiting for the ratings to come in. They thought the angle was going to close the gap with Nitro. They thought it was going to change the business. Instead, it flopped in every demographic except older women. Viewers were switching to WCW while it was happening. Both men were devastated. By the spring of 1997, Pillman returned to active competition. He joined the Hart Foundation alongside Bret Hart, Owen Hart, the British Bulldog, and the Anvil. The greatest night of his career came on July 6, 1997, at Canadian Stampede. The Hart Foundation against Steve Austin, Goldust, Ken Shamrock, and the Legion of Doom. It was supposed to be a throwaway show. It turned out to be one of the greatest pay-per-views in wrestling history. Pillman called people afterward, admitting he had completely misread Bret Hart's direction for the group. He said nothing he had ever done in the business compared to that night. Not the matches with Liger, not the work with Flair, not the turning on Sting, nothing. But that was one of the few bright spots in an otherwise rapid and terrifying decline. By the late summer and fall of 1997, Brian Pillman was deteriorating in front of everyone. His wife Melanie later revealed that he was spending more than $1,000 every month on human growth hormones. He was taking pain pills prescribed by a doctor who was writing scripts illegally. He was using herbal supplements containing ephedrine to try to burn off body fat. The combination of stimulants, hormones, painkillers, and whatever else was coursing through his system was putting catastrophic stress on his cardiovascular system. His behavior was becoming erratic in ways that went far beyond the loose cannon character. Kim Wood, his mentor and father figure, the longtime strength coach of the Cincinnati Bengals, refused to see him or talk to him in the final months of his life. Pillman had come to Wood's house one day, and Wood noticed fresh needle marks in his arm and a grotesquely swollen forearm. Wood told him to get out, told him not to come back. His children were upstairs sleeping, and he was not going to have that in his home. Most of the wrestlers in the WWE locker room were keeping their distance too. Pillman was part of the Hart Foundation, the top heel group in the company. He had friends like Mick Foley and Austin, who he had known since WCW. But his behavior had become so alarming that most of them wanted nothing to do with him. The wrestlers were quietly discussing how to stage an intervention. They could see what was coming. They just could not figure out how to stop it. Jim Ross, who was head of talent relations, arranged for Pillman to be randomly drug tested. Pillman felt betrayed. He called Ross and told him he could not believe that Ross of all people would do this to him. That Ross had always had his back. That Ross had always been there for him. Ross tried to explain that he was simply trying to save his life. Pillman was furious. He called Dave Meltzer and ranted about how much he hated Jim Ross. The test came back positive for prescription drugs and steroids. Paul Heyman, who had known Pillman from his brief time in ECW, was telling people openly that Pillman was not going to survive. In mid-September of 1997, just weeks before Brian's death, Heyman passed along a message through a mutual contact. The message was blunt. Pillman was on substances and was not going to last more than a few more weeks. When Shane Douglas suggested booking Pillman for ECW's November to Remember pay-per-view. On November 30th, Heyman refused to even consider it. He told Douglas flatly that Brian was not going to be alive by then. That is the context for the final 48 hours. A man who was brilliant and creative and talented and driven. A man who had overcome throat surgeries and football injuries and a car wreck that should have killed him. A man whose body was now being consumed by the very substances he was using to keep performing. A man whose friends had given up trying to reach him. A man whose wife was in the process of divorcing him, though they still lived together, with Brian banished to the basement of their home. A man whose mentor would not let him through the front door. A man who everyone around him believed was going to die, and who kept showing up for work anyway. Now let us talk about Saturday, October 4th, 1997. Brian Pillman was in Minnesota for a WWE house show in St. Paul. He was deep in his feud with Goldust over Marlena, which had been the central storyline of his final months. The feud had seen Pillman win Marlena's services at Ground Zero in September. He had repackaged her in degrading outfits and darker makeup. He implied that he had slept with her. It was classic Attitude Era storytelling, edgy and provocative, and Pillman was at the center of it. That night, Pillman wrestled Goldust. He lost. It was the last professional wrestling match Brian Pillman would ever have. A house show in St. Paul, Minnesota, in front of a crowd that had no idea they were watching a dead man wrestle. No cameras recording for posterity. No special entrances. No dramatic send-off. Just another night on the road. Another town. Another match. Another performance from a body that was breaking down and a spirit that refused to acknowledge it. The last time Brian Pillman ever stepped between the ropes, it was at a house show that almost nobody remembers. There is no footage circulating online. There are no fan reviews breaking down every spot. It was just a match on a card in St. Paul that came and went like 1,000 matches before it. The crowd cheered and booed and bought their popcorn and went home and never thought about it again. They did not know they had just witnessed the final chapter of one of the most compelling careers in wrestling history. They did not know that the man they had just watched perform was living on borrowed time measured in hours rather than years. There are no detailed accounts of how Pillman looked or behaved at that house show. What we know is that people around him in recent weeks had described him as visibly unwell. His weight had fluctuated. His behavior was erratic. He had failed the drug test and had been spiraling. Whether anyone at the house show that night pulled him aside and said something, whether anyone looked at him and felt that chill of recognition that this was not going to end well, we do not know. What we know is that after the show, Pillman drove to the Budgetal Motel in Bloomington, Minnesota. He checked in. He went to his room. And that was the last time anyone spoke to Brian Pillman alive. The next day was Sunday, October 5th, 1997. It was the day of Bad Blood in Your House, one of the biggest pay-per-view events of the year. The main event was the first ever Hell in a Cell match between The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. It was the night Kane would debut. It was a massive show, and Brian Pillman was scheduled to be part of it. His match against Dude Love was on the card, with Goldust handcuffed to the ring corner as a stipulation. It was supposed to be a significant chapter in his ongoing storyline. The standard call time for wrestlers on pay-per-view day was around 1 in the afternoon. By mid-afternoon, talent had been filtering into the Kiel Center in St. Louis. The building was buzzing with the energy that always preceded a major show. Agents were going over match layouts, wrestlers were getting ready, production crews were setting up cameras and pyro. But there was a problem. Brian Pillman had not arrived. Now, in the wrestling business, people being late was not unheard of. Wrestlers overslept. They missed flights. They got stuck in traffic. It happened. But as the afternoon wore on and Pillman still had not shown up or called in, concern began to grow. This was a pay-per-view. You did not miss a pay-per-view. Even if you were hurt, even if you were sick, you showed up. By 5 in the afternoon, everyone was accounted for except Brian Pillman. 4 hours past call time. No phone call, no message, nothing. Jim Cornette, who was working in talent relations, was instructed by Bruce Pritchard to track Pillman down. Cornette called the Budgetal Motel in Bloomington. He explained who he was and asked to be connected to Pillman's room or to have someone check on him. The front desk put him on hold. Cornette waited. He probably assumed they were ringing the room. Maybe Brian was sleeping. Maybe he was in the shower. Maybe he had overslept and lost his phone. There were 100 innocent explanations. Then the person came back on the line, and what they said changed everything. Mr. Pillman is dead. The words hung in the air. Cornette's first instinct was disbelief. This was Brian Pillman, the loose cannon. The man who had built an entire career on making people believe things that were not real. The man who had convinced an entire wrestling promotion to fire him as part of a work. The man who had pointed a loaded gun at Steve Austin on live television and made the entire world gasp. Cornette's immediate thought was that this was a work, that Pillman was pulling one of his legendary ribs, that any moment Brian was going to pick up the phone and laugh and say he got them all. Because that is what Brian Pillman did. He made you believe the unbelievable. But then Cornette realized the police were there. They were on the phone. This was not a rib. This was not a work. This was not the loose cannon playing one of his games. This was real. Brian Pillman had been found dead in his hotel room by housekeeping staff at 1:09 p.m. Central Time. He was 35 years old. While the wrestling world was preparing for one of the biggest shows of the year, Brian Pillman had already been dead for hours, lying in that motel room, alone. Cornette was choking up as he processed the information. He told a WWE employee to go get Bruce Pritchard. The employee said Pritchard was busy. Cornette could barely get the words out. Brian is dead. Go get Bruce. He did not want to hear those words then. He still does not want to hear them decades later. The news spread through the Kiel Center like a shockwave. Wrestlers who had been warming up stopped. Agents who had been going over match formats put down their clipboards. The backstage area, which minutes before had been humming with the controlled chaos of pay-per-view preparation, went silent. Steve Austin did not want to believe it. He and Pillman had been best friends in the business. They had created the Hollywood Blondes together. They had traveled the roads together. They had spent late nights in hotel rooms talking about the business, dreaming about the future, scheming about angles that would change wrestling forever. Austin still had the gold chain Pillman had given him to complete the Blondes look years earlier. He would keep it for the rest of his life. It was one of the few things from his career he never wanted to give away. When the 10-bell salute was performed on Monday Night Raw the following night, with the entire roster standing at the entrance ramp, Austin was visibly emotional. The reality that his friend was truly gone had finally settled in. The stone-cold character was nowhere to be found. It was just Steve, standing there, grieving. Owen Hart, who had been in the Hart Foundation with Pillman and who would himself die tragically in a WWE ring less than 2 years later, did not fully understand the situation when Melanie called looking for information. The cruelty of that particular detail is hard to overstate. Owen Hart, comforting a widow, not knowing that he himself was on borrowed time. Jim Ross got the call late that night. He thinks it was Jack Lanza, one of the agents, who told him. Ross was already in St. Louis. He later said it was shockingly sad, that he still thinks about what he could have done along the way to help Brian, that he had tried the drug testing and the interventions and every tool available to him, but none of it was enough. Back at the Pillman household, Brian Pillman Jr. was just a small child. He did not fully understand what was happening. In his young mind, he tried to apply logic to something that had no logic. His father went to work one day and just decided not to come back. That was the only explanation that made sense to a child's brain. The full weight of it would not hit him for years. The show had to go on. That is the wrestling business. The show always goes on. Vince McMahon announced Pillman's death during the free-for-all pre-show segment. He told the audience that Brian Pillman had been found dead in his hotel room that afternoon. That law enforcement did not suspect foul play. The announcement was somber but also awkward. McMahon repeated it during the pay-per-view broadcast itself, during the Nation of Domination's entrance at the top of the show. And then the show continued. Matches were wrestled, storylines were advanced. The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels tore the house down in Hell in a Cell. Kane debuted. The handling of the announcement was widely criticized. McMahon transitioned from talking about Pillman's death to a tag team match in a way that felt jarring and tone-deaf. He speculated about the possible cause of death, floating the idea that it could have been an overdose before any autopsy had been conducted. Jim Ross, sitting at the commentary table, looked visibly uncomfortable. 2 additional matches had to be added to the card to fill the gap left by the cancellation of Pillman's bout. The Disciples of Apocalypse faced Los Boricuas in an 8-man tag. It was filler. Everyone knew it was filler. But the runtime needed to be filled and the show needed to go on. What happened the next night on Monday Night Raw was even more controversial. Vince McMahon convinced Melanie Pillman, Brian's estranged wife, to appear on live television less than 24 hours after her husband's death. Melanie later said she was not coerced. She agreed to do it. But she had one request. She asked McMahon not to bring up drugs. The autopsy had not been completed. The cause of death had not been determined. She did not want to speculate about pills on national television while her husband's body was barely cold. McMahon agreed. And then he went on the air, and one of the first things he asked her about was Brian's use of painkillers. Melanie later said that if they had been in the same room, she would have slapped him. Jim Cornette was furious. He was deeply uncomfortable watching the interview on a professional wrestling program. He believed McMahon should have written Melanie a check for $100,000 and kept her off television entirely. Jim Ross shared similar sentiments. It remains one of the most criticized moments in WWE history. The autopsy results came back in the following days. The official cause of death was a heart attack caused by previously undetected atherosclerotic heart disease, the same condition that had killed Brian Pillman's father when Brian was 3 months old. The same genetic time bomb that had been ticking inside his chest for 35 years without anyone knowing it was there. But the undetected heart condition was not the whole story. And this is where the tragedy deepens because it was never just one thing with Brian Pillman. It was layers upon layers of damage, each one compounding the last. The coroner found cocaine in his system. Bottles of painkillers and muscle relaxers were in the hotel room. His wife had described the growth hormone use. the ephedrine, the illegally prescribed medications. The years of steroid use that had begun all the way back in his football days. The physical toll of hundreds of professional wrestling matches on a body that was already compromised by a devastating car accident. The fused ankle that sent pain signals screaming through his nervous system every single day. The mental toll of maintaining a character that required him to be the most unpredictable, most intense, most dangerous-seeming person in any room he entered. All of it had contributed to creating the conditions under which that hereditary heart condition could do its worst. The heart disease was the bullet. Everything else loaded the gun. Brian Pillman did not die of one thing. He died of everything. He died of a genetic condition he inherited from a father he never knew. He died of a car accident that should have ended his career, but instead just made him more desperate to keep going. He died of a business that demanded physical perfection, and then looked the other way when its performers destroyed themselves trying to achieve it. He died of painkillers that doctors should never have prescribed and that the company should have done more to address. He died of his own stubbornness and refusal to accept that he could not outwork and outwill and outsmart his way through anything, the way he had done his entire life. He died because he was Brian Pillman, and being Brian Pillman was ultimately not survivable. After his death, Brian Pillman was cremated. Half of his ashes were given to Melanie. The other half were given to Steve Austin. That detail tells you everything about who mattered most in Brian's world. His wife, complicated and contentious as that relationship was. And his best friend in the business, the man who would go on to become the biggest star in wrestling history, in part because of lessons he learned from the creative genius of Brian Pillman. The aftermath for the Pillman family was devastating. Melanie spiraled into drug and alcohol abuse. She nearly died of alcohol poisoning while Brian Jr. was still a child. When she remarried, the stepfather was abusive. He would use dogs trained to keep the children in their rooms. He would physically hurt them. The money that was raised by the wrestling community through memorial shows and donations was, according to Brian Jr., spent by Melanie and her new husband on themselves. The children went from a comfortable life to not knowing when their next meal was coming. Running water was turned off. Everything the kids latched onto was taken away. Brian Jr. later described growing up without a father to throw a football with, without anyone to play catch with, without any of the simple things that other kids took for granted. Everything he ever loved was destroyed or confiscated by an abusive stepfather while his mother was too consumed by addiction to protect him. And yet Brian Pillman Jr. grew up to become a professional wrestler himself. He followed his father into the business that had killed him. He wore the tights. He took the bumps. He carried the name. Jim Ross told him to take the positive traits from his father and avoid the negative ones at all cost. Whether he has been able to do that, whether anyone could fully separate the good from the bad when it comes to the legacy of Brian Pillman, is an open question. In 2024, Brittany Evans, Pillman's daughter, signed a Legends contract with WWE, allowing merchandise bearing her father's name and likeness to be produced under her authority. The family was finally getting some measure of control over the legacy that had been taken from them. Les Thatcher, a longtime Cincinnati wrestling figure, spearheaded the Brian Pillman memorial shows beginning in 1998. Those events became annual highlights, raising over $125,000 for the Pillman family over the years. They were also remarkable for being among the only events where WWE, WCW, and ECW talent all worked on the same card. In death, Brian Pillman accomplished something he could never have done in life. He brought the entire wrestling industry together in one building. The wrestling business learned lessons from Brian Pillman's death. Or at least it should have. The wellness policy that the WWE eventually implemented, the drug testing and the rehabilitation programs and the medical screenings came too late for Brian. But they came. Not fast enough, not comprehensively enough, but they came. What makes the final 48 hours of Brian Pillman so devastating is not the surprise of it. It is the absolute lack of surprise. Everyone who knew him saw this coming. Paul Heyman predicted it with chilling accuracy weeks in advance. Kim Wood had cut him out of his life because he could not bear to watch the final act. The wrestlers in the locker room were planning an intervention they never got to execute. Jim Ross had tried the drug testing and the conversations and the appeals to reason. Melanie was divorcing him, hoping it would serve as a wake-up call. Everyone saw the end coming. Nobody could stop it. And Brian Pillman himself, the master manipulator, the man who had fooled an entire industry into believing his fabrications, had apparently fooled himself into believing that he could survive anything, that the rules of biology and mortality and consequence did not apply to him. Because they never had before. He had survived the throat surgeries. He had survived the football injuries. He had survived the car wreck. He had beaten every odd that life had thrown at him. Until the night of October 4th, 1997, when he went to sleep in a budget motel in Bloomington, Minnesota, and his heart, weakened by genetics and ravaged by substances, simply stopped. He was supposed to wrestle the next day. He was supposed to continue his feud with Goldust. He was supposed to be part of the Attitude Era that was just beginning to take shape. He was supposed to be there for the ride that would turn professional wrestling into the hottest entertainment property on the planet. He had helped build the foundation for it. The edginess, the blurred lines, the willingness to push boundaries that had never been pushed before. Stone Cold Steve Austin was his former tag partner and best friend. The Attitude Era had Brian Pillman's fingerprints all over it, but he missed it, all of it. He died on the doorstep of the era he helped create. There is a moment in the Dark Side of the Ring documentary about Pillman where Jim Ross says something that cuts right to the heart of it. He talks about trying to convince Brian that there were other options for him in the business, that he did not have to keep destroying himself in the ring, that his mind and his mouth were valuable enough to sustain a career even if his body could not. And Ross says he failed at that. He could not get through to him. That failure haunts Jim Ross to this day. It haunts Steve Austin. It haunts Jim Cornette. It haunts everyone who knew Brian Pillman and loved him and watched him disappear into the character he created. The loose cannon was supposed to be a work, a performance, a means to an end. Instead, it became the end itself. The character devoured the man. The lines between Brian Pillman the person and Brian Pillman the loose cannon blurred so completely that nobody, perhaps not even Brian himself, could tell where one ended and the other began. He was playing the role at home. He was playing it with his family. He was playing it with his friends. He was playing it in his hotel room the night his heart stopped beating. When you look at the final 48 hours of Brian Pillman, what you see is the last 2 days of a man who had been dying for months. A man whose body and mind and relationships and career were all collapsing simultaneously. A man who wrestled Goldust on a Saturday night house show in St. Paul, and then drove to a budget motel and went to sleep and never woke up. A man who was found by a stranger. A hotel maid who opened a door expecting to change some sheets and instead found a dead professional wrestler surrounded by pill bottles. He was 35 years old. His father had died of the same condition. His son, who he did not know Melanie was pregnant with at the time, would grow up to wrestle under his name. The wrestling business has a long and terrible history of losing its performers too young. Brian Pillman was not the first. He was not the last. But his death has a particular sting to it because of what he represented. He was the smartest guy in the room, the most creative mind in the building, the man who saw the future of wrestling before anyone else and tried to drag the entire industry there through sheer force of will and personality. And the future arrived. Just not for him. The Attitude Era exploded months after his death. Austin became the biggest star in the world. DX pushed boundaries that Pillman had been pushing years before them. The Monday Night Wars reached their peak. Wrestling became mainstream in a way it had not been since the 1980s. Pay-per-view buy rates went through the roof. Ratings hit numbers that seemed impossible. Merchandise flew off shelves. And Brian Pillman, who had planted so many of the seeds for that revolution, who had been willing to point a gun on live television and blur every line in the book years before anyone else dared to, was not there to see any of it. Imagine a healthy Brian Pillman in 1998. Imagine him in the Attitude Era with a working ankle and a clear mind and that creative brain firing on all cylinders. Imagine the promos he would have cut, the feuds he would have had, the moments he would have created. It is one of the greatest what-ifs in professional wrestling history. And the answer to that what-if died with him in a budget motel in Bloomington, Minnesota. His final match was a loss to Goldust at a house show. His final night was spent alone in a budget motel. His final morning was silence. And then a hotel maid opened a door and the story of Brian Pillman was over. Except it was not over. Because his son carries the name. Because his friends carry the memories. Because Steve Austin still has that gold chain. Because Jim Ross still wonders what he could have done differently. Because the Attitude Era still bears the marks of his creativity and his willingness to push every boundary he encountered. Brian Pillman died on October 5, 1997. But the things he created, the ideas he had, the lines he blurred, the doors he kicked open, those things did not die with him. They lived on in every worked shoot and every boundary-pushing angle and every wrestler who dared to blur the line between character and reality. The loose cannon fired one last shot on the way out, and the echo is still reverberating through professional wrestling nearly 3 decades later. They do not make them like Brian Pillman anymore. And the price he paid for being who he was should make all of us grateful for that, and heartbroken by it at the same time. Like and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind professional wrestling's most tragic and compelling figures. Until next time.